My dad told me I was nothing worth keeping.
He said it in the same tired voice he used when reminding me to turn off the porch.
Light. And somehow that made it cut deeper. I was 18. I was pregnant. And he looked at me like I had turned into something filthy he could not scrub off. If you have ever had a moment when someone you love decides you are no longer welcome in the world you both once shared, then you already know why I am telling this story. And if you want to know what becomes of a man who throws his pregnant daughter into a snowstorm, you should keep listening, because I promise the ending is not the one he planned. I am Jane, 28 years old, and even after 10 years have passed since that moment, I can still feel that night on my skin. Not the cold, even though it was brutal. The cold was simple. The cold was honest. It told the truth about itself. What I felt most was the way my dad's eyes went blank when I told him I was having a baby. He did not ask who the father was. He did not sit down or steady himself. He just stared at me like I had slipped out of my own body and turned into a stranger standing in his kitchen. I waited for him to speak. I thought maybe he would sigh or shake his head or say something about disappointment. Parents do that. They disappoint easily. They recover, but my dad did not recover. He made a decision. I saw it form on his face like frost. You are a shame. That was all. No raised voice, no anger, just exhaustion. Like he had grown tired of even pretending I belonged to him. I felt my throat close. I was not stupid. I knew the timing was terrible. I knew he had sacrificed to raise me. I knew I had broken a rule he held tightly. But I did not expect to be erased. Not in an instant. Not before I could even understand what carrying a child would mean for my life. The kitchen felt too small. The walls felt too close. I remember reaching for the counter because my knees weakened, and I did not want him to see me stumble. The baby inside me fluttered, a soft reminder that I was no longer alone, even in the moment he decided he had no daughter anymore. He disgusted me. That is what he said next. But what scares me now, after all these years, is that he said it the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis. Detached. Final. Like he was confirming something that had been obvious for a long time. I tried to speak. I almost said I was sorry. I almost begged. At 18, sorry is the only tool you have. But the words did not come. They dried out before they reached my tongue. Shame does that. It takes the language out of your mouth and replaces it with silence. He walked past me. He pushed my bags across the floor with the edge of his boot, not even bothering to pick them up. I watched them skid like forgotten belongings in a thrift store bin. The zipper on one of them snapped open as it hit the door frame, and a sweater I had worn since freshman year spilled onto the tiles. He did not look at it. He did not look at me. Pick them up. You are not raising that child in my house. I remember thinking he would change his mind once I stepped outside, that he would call my name or slam the door open and demand I come back in. I had watched enough movies to believe parents do not actually let their children walk into storms alone. But real life is quieter. Real life is crueler. When he closed the door, it was soft, not dramatic, not angry. A soft click that felt like a sentence. I wonder sometimes if he knew that sound would follow me for years. I wonder if he cared. The cold hit me in a heartbeat later. It stole the breath right from my lungs. The snow was already drifting across the porch in thick sheets. The sky was an eraser wiping out everything around me, and I felt so small I could have disappeared without anyone noticing. I bent to pick up my bags. They felt heavier than I remembered. Or maybe I felt weaker. The baby shifted again, a tiny movement that broke me inside because I suddenly understood that the two of us would be carrying this alone. There would be no cradle in my old bedroom, no baby shower, no small celebrations where people touched my belly with joy, just survival. And me. I stepped off the porch, and my boots sank into snow that reached almost to my ankles. The wind pushed against me like a living thing. My breath fogged the air, and the cold gnawed its way through my coat. I pulled the hood tight, even though the fur was thin, and the fabric was cheap, and the storm did not care about any of it. The driveway looked endless. I do not remember how long it took to reach the street, only that every step felt like walking away from the last version of myself that ever believed my dad would love me, no matter what.
People say the world looks different when you know you are on your own. They do not tell you it sounds different, too. Snow muffles everything. The crunch of my boots, the rush of the wind. Even my heartbeat went quiet. But the silence inside my chest was louder than the storm. It was the silence of being unwanted. It was the silence of being told you have no place to return to. When I reached the road, I stopped. My legs shook. My hands burned from the cold. I did not know where to go. At 18, you do not have a backup plan. You barely have a plan at all. I looked back once. Just once. The house was already fading behind the curtain of snow. The porch light glowed faintly, a small reminder of everything I had lost in a matter of minutes. I searched for movement inside. I hoped for it. I prayed for it. But the windows stayed dark, and the door stayed closed. So I walked. I did not look back again. A stranger eventually pulled over. A woman with kind eyes who wrapped me in a blanket and drove me to a shelter. That ride is blurry. My teeth chattered too hard to speak. My hands could not unclench from the straps of my bags. The baby kept moving, as if trying to keep me awake. The shelter staff asked questions. I answered some and ignored others. They gave me soup and a cot and told me everything would feel different in the morning. It did not. But I pretended it did because hope, even the small, fragile kind, is something you hold on to with both hands when you have nothing else. The months that followed were a mix of exhaustion and determination. I worked wherever people would hire a pregnant teenager. I cleaned houses. I folded laundry in the back of a dry cleaner. I waited tables in a diner where the manager yelled more than he breathed. But every paycheck, no matter how small, felt like proof that I could keep going. I could build something. I could raise a child without repeating the cruelty that raised me. But even as I rebuilt my life, I carried that night inside me. It lived in my bones. It shaped how I moved through the world. It taught me not to expect rescue. It taught me to stand on my own legs even when they were shaking. And it taught me that some wounds do not scar over. They stay raw, reminding you who you must never become. I thought I had found peace eventually, a quiet place to breathe. A home with no shouting, no slam doors, no shame. Mara grew, bright and curious, never once doubting she was wanted. I built a life that felt steady, predictable, mine. I believed the past was finished, buried, gone. Then one morning my phone rang. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and answered without thinking. The security officer at the gate sounded hesitant, like he was delivering news that did not fit the world I lived in now. "Ma'am, your dad is here. He arrived with a moving truck and is requesting access to your residence." For a long moment, I did not breathe. The storm I walked into at 18 had found its way back to my door, and this time, I was not the one who would be left out in the cold. The guard's voice was steady but hesitant when he told me my dad was waiting in America. The gate. I did not move at first. I stood in my kitchen with a small towel still in my hand, the room too bright for what that name pulled up inside me. I asked him to repeat himself, even though I had heard every word clearly. My dad had come with a moving truck and wanted to speak to me. There was no mention of an emergency, no request passed through someone else, just a man at the gate with too much expectation and nowhere else to put it. I told the guard I would come down. The walk to the entrance felt strangely calm. My heart did not race the way it once had. My hands did not tremble. I kept my coat zipped and pulled my hair into a loose tie, giving myself the smallest moment to settle before facing the past I thought I had outrun. When I stepped outside the building, the air bit at my cheeks, but I barely noticed. The moving truck was impossible to miss. It looked tired and worn, parked crookedly against the curb, as if even it knew the weight of the story that brought it here. My dad stood beside it, leaning slightly against the front bumper. He looked older than I expected. There were lines across his face that had not been there a decade earlier, and his shoulders curved inward, like life had pushed him harder than he wanted anyone to know. Still, the first thing I recognized was not his age. It was the way he looked at me with a kind of unspoken authority, as if time had not changed the rules he believed we lived under. I walked toward him slowly. He straightened, but did not smile. His eyes scanned my face in a way that made me feel 18 again, but only for a breath.
He told me he needed help. His voice cracked a little when he mentioned that he had been sick and that things had gone wrong with the people he had trusted. He did not give details. He did not mention names. He just said he had nowhere else to go. For a moment, I let the words settle inside me. They did not hit the way they once would have. They did not knock me down. They simply hovered, and then they passed through me like a cold gust. I nodded once and told him he could come upstairs for a bit while we talked. His surprise flashed across his face quickly, then faded beneath something that looked uncomfortably close to relief. We rode the elevator in silence. I stood slightly apart from him, not out of fear, but out of instinct. The doors opened on my floor and I led him into my condo. It was small, warm, lived in. He paused just inside the doorway, taking in the kitchen, the walls, the narrow hallway that led to the bedroom Mara and I shared. He noticed the small dining table and the lack of extra space. He noticed the single bedroom door. His expression tightened, but he said nothing. I gestured toward a chair and offered him coffee. It felt strange, performing a courtesy for a man who once turned me out into a storm. But hospitality is not forgiveness. It is a boundary with a polite face. While the coffee brewed, he began to speak. He talked about his health. He mentioned problems he had been dealing with. He said he had tried to make things work with people he thought cared about him and that they had left him behind when he could no longer be useful. He kept his words vague, as if the details were too hard to say or too revealing. I listened without interrupting. I watched the way he rubbed his hands together, the way he avoided my eyes when the story brushed too close to discomfort. I let him talk, not because I believed him, but because I needed to hear the pieces he chose to reveal. His voice carried a tiredness that felt real, but the entitlement underneath it never left. After a few minutes, he looked around and asked if he could use the restroom. I pointed to the small door near the hallway. His steps were slower than I remembered, and I could hear the faucet turn on a moment after he shut the door. I sat at the table and wrapped my hands around my own cup, letting the warmth steady me. When I looked toward the chair where he had been sitting, I noticed his phone lying face up on the table. The screen lit up with a vibration. A name flashed across the surface. It was the name of the woman he had chosen after my mom. The woman who had taken up space in the home I once lived in. The woman who had never looked at me with anything but impatience. The message preview was short and cut off at the edge of the screen. It was only a few words, but they carried a sharpness that sank into my stomach. It told me that something about his story did not fit. I did not touch the phone. I did not read beyond what was visible. I simply looked at it long enough to feel the first shift of suspicion settle in my heart. Ribs. The faucet turned off. A moment later, he stepped out of the restroom, wiping his hands on his jacket as if he had not seen the towel hanging right beside the sink. He walked slowly back to the table and sat down again. His eyes darted briefly to his phone. He must have seen something in my face because he straightened and took a breath before he spoke. He began to explain that he needed a place to stay, not just for a night. For a while, maybe longer. He gestured loosely around the condo, ignoring the fact that he had just taken in the size of it. He said he could help with things. He said he would stay out of the way. He said he just needed time to get back on his feet. I let him finish. I let the words hang between us. Then I told him the truth. I told him he could see how small the condo was, that it had only one bedroom, that it barely had space for me and Mara. I told him that he could not stay here, not because I lacked sympathy, but because it was simply not possible. He tried to argue. He said I could make room. He said people make do in tighter spaces. He said family finds a way. The irony in that last sentence made something inside me go still. I looked at him for a long moment, not with anger, but with an understanding that felt heavy and cold. I told him I could help him with a motel. I told him I was willing to pay for 2 weeks. That was long enough for him to look for something more permanent. It was a clear yes within a larger no, and he heard both. He sagged back in the chair and pressed his lips together in a thin line. He looked around the room again, this time really seeing it, seeing how little space there was, seeing that the life I had built did not include room for a man who once cast me out like a problem to be solved with distance. He asked when we could go. His tone was resigned, but not grateful. I stood, put on my coat, and told him we could leave now. I picked up my keys and walked toward the door. He followed a few steps behind me. On the way out, he glanced once more at the small photographs on the counter, the ones of me and Mara celebrating her birthday with a cake we baked ourselves. He paused only for a second, then looked away. We rode the elevator down together.
The guard opened the front door for us as we stepped outside. My dad climbed into the passenger seat of the moving truck. I stood on the curb watching him adjust the seatbelt. I told him I would meet him at the motel and handle the check-in. He nodded without speaking. As the truck pulled away, the morning felt quieter than before. I could feel the old ache of the girl I had been pulling at the edges of my memory, but it did not take over. I closed my coat around me and started back toward the building. Each step felt like a small reminder. I was not the girl he had thrown into the snowstorm. Not anymore. I had survived without him. I had built a life without him, and facing him now did not undo any of it. The past had walked into my home, sat at my table, and asked for space it no longer had the right to claim. I locked my door behind me when I stepped back inside. The room felt steady, mine. I took a breath and understood something with quiet certainty. Whatever story my dad had brought with him, whatever trouble waited behind the thin veil of his word, I was no longer the one who would break first. Seeing my dad in my apartment that morning stirred something in me that I had spent years burying. It was not panic. It was not even anger. It was a memory, thick and cold and familiar, rising up from a place I had hoped would stay quiet forever. As soon as the door closed behind him and the condo settled into stillness, I felt the past pushing against the edges of the present. I did not want to think about that night, but memories are stubborn creatures. They return when they want, not when you invite them. And sitting across from my dad, listening to the weary scrape in his voice, watching the way his hands trembled slightly as he wrapped them around the coffee mug, I felt that night pulling me back. It began with a single sentence. I was 18 years old and standing in the kitchen with my heart pounding so loud. I could hear it echoing in the metal pans hung on the wall. I had rehearsed the words again and again. I am pregnant. They felt heavy in my mouth, like stones I was not sure I could lift. When I finally said them, they fell into the room with a soft thud that seemed to shake the ground beneath my feet. My dad did not shout. I had expected shouting. I had expected his face to redden and his voice to climb the walls like it had during every argument I remembered from my childhood. But he did not give me that. He gave me something worse. He gave me silence first, a long, heavy silence that pressed against my ribs like a hand. Then he gave me disappointment that felt like it had been waiting for this exact moment. Then he told me I was a shame. I did not understand how a word could cut deeper than a blade. His voice was even, almost bored, as if he had been expecting to use it on me someday. Shame. It wrapped itself around my throat and dragged my breath down with it. I tried to steady myself, gripping the edge of the counter behind me, but it felt like my hands passed through air. My dad told me I disgusted him. I can still hear the tone of it. Cold, detached. Not angry. Anger would have suggested he cared. Instead, he looked at me as if he had discovered something rotten in the house and needed to throw it out quickly before the smell spread. I felt the floor shift under my feet. I remember thinking that if he had hit me, it would have hurt less because, at least, it would have had a real impact. Something I could point to and say, this is why I am broken. My mom stood in the doorway for only a moment. Her eyes were wide and shining, not with tears, but with fear. She looked at my dad, then at me, then back at the floor. I waited for her to speak. I waited for her to reach out and touch my arm. But she turned away. Maybe she believed it was not her place. Maybe she believed he was right. Maybe she simply did not know how to stand between a man like him and the girl he had raised. Whatever the reason, her silence became another crack inside me. He pushed my bags across the floor with the edge of his shoe. They slid toward me in slow motion. I had packed them earlier that day, not because I thought I would need them, but because I wanted to be ready for them. The moment he decided he needed space. I had imagined a fight. I had imagined crying. I had not imagined the emptiness in his eyes when he told me that I was dead too. This family. The words hit with the weight of truth, not objective truth. His truth, the truth he believed about me, the truth he wanted to shape my life with. I felt myself fold inward. Something inside me went quiet. The way a house goes dark, room by room, during a power outage. He told me I would not raise that child under his roof. He said he would not allow people to think that of him. He said I could take my choices and live with them somewhere else. Then he turned his back to me. He walked to the window and pulled the curtain aside as if checking the sky for a storm he had no idea he was creating inside me. When he opened the door, the cold came rushing in. It wrapped around my legs and crept under my sleeves and tightened its grip around my spine. My bags were at my feet. My breath trembled in my chest. I wanted to speak. I wanted to tell him I was scared. I wanted to tell him I needed him, but shame stole the words from me. I swallowed the fear until it sat heavy in my throat. He waited for me to step outside. When I hesitated, his expression sharpened. I stepped out because I knew there was no place inside that house left for me. The porch sagged beneath my weight. The snow crunched under my boots. The wind carried needles of ice that stabbed at my cheeks. My hands ached with cold before I even reached the gate. The soft click of the door behind me was the loudest sound I had ever heard. Final, absolute. It told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in his world. I stared ahead, not trusting myself to look back. If I had turned around and seen him standing there, I might have broken. If I had turned around and seen the door already closed, I might have shattered, so I kept walking. The street lights were dim under the thick curtain of snow. The air tasted metallic, sharp, and unforgiving. My bags felt heavier with each step. The wind pushed against me like a hand, trying to steer me away from the path I had taken for so long. My legs shook when the cold sliced through the thin fabric of my jeans. My lungs burned with each breath. But the hardest part was the weight inside me, not physical. Emotional. The weight of the future pressing down with questions I had no answers for. How was I supposed to raise a child alone? How was I supposed to find shelter in a world that had just shown me how easy it was to lose everything? How was I supposed to survive when the one person who should have protected me had chosen to cast me out? A car passed slowly, its headlights carving a path through the white haze. It did not stop. Another followed. And another. The sound of tires on snow reminded me that life continued around me while mine was being undone. I kept walking until my vision blurred and my hands went numb. I do not remember when I finally sank to my knees. I do not remember deciding to stop. I remember only the feeling of melting into the snow, the cold seeping into my bones, the thought that maybe I was invisible now. Maybe this was what my dad meant when he said those words. Maybe he believed I could vanish. A pair of headlights stopped beside me. A door opened. A woman's voice reached me, warm and worried. She wrapped the blanket around my shoulders and helped me stand. Her kindness hit harder than the storm because I did not believe I deserved it. She guided me into her car, turned the heat up, and told me I was safe now. I nodded, though I did not believe it. At the shelter, they gave me hot soup that tasted like salt and comfort. They asked if I had anyone to call. I shook my head. They asked if I wanted to talk. I shook my head again. They asked if I needed medical care. I whispered that I was pregnant. A nurse pressed a warm hand to my back and told me that I was not alone. I let myself believe her for a moment. The cot they gave me felt softer than any bed I had slept in before. I lay awake most of the night, listening to the hum of the heater and the quiet rhythm of other women breathing around me. I placed my hand on my stomach and felt the smallest flutter. It broke me and healed me at the same time. I whispered that I would protect us both. I whispered that we would find a way. And deep down, I whispered something else. I whispered that I would never forget what my dad had done. Sometimes people think that being thrown out is a single moment. They imagine a door slamming, or a bag being tossed, or a fight erupting. But it is never just one moment. It is a series of small losses leading to a final fall. It is the silence before the sentence. It is the weight of each word that tells you who you are allowed to be. When I woke the next morning, my clothes were stiff from drying near the heater. My throat burned from cold air. My back ached from tension. But I stood. I walked. I dressed. I carried my belongings out of that shelter with a determination stronger than the night before. I did not know where I was going next, but I knew one thing with certainty. I would never beg for a place in my dad's house again. And as I sat in my living room now,
years later, with the air still carrying the scent of the coffee he had barely touched. I realized the past had not returned to reopen the wound. It had returned to show me how fully I had healed. Giving birth was nothing like I imagined. I had spent months preparing for the moment, reading every pamphlet the shelter nurse handed me, trying to understand what it meant to bring a life into the world when I was barely holding my own together. But no brochure could explain the terror that washed over me the night my daughter arrived. I remember gripping the metal rail of the hospital bed, sweat rolling down my back as if I were trying to climb out of my own skin, praying for strength, praying for courage, praying that I would not break before she even took her first breath. The room was cold and bright, the smell of antiseptic mixed with the faint sweetness of baby lotion from a nearby cart. Nurses moved around me with quick, practiced steps, speaking calmly, guiding me through each contraction with gentle voices and steady hands. They did not know my story. They did not know that I had walked into the emergency room alone, with nothing but a small duffel bag and a folded birth plan that I had written in the shelter a week earlier. They did not know that I had no one to hold my hand or whisper comfort into my ear. Still, they treated me as if I mattered. That alone felt like a miracle. When the final wave of pain surged through me, I thought my body would split apart. I forced myself to breathe, to push, to keep going, even though my strength felt thin as paper. And then she arrived, my daughter. The room seemed to tilt and soften all at once. They laid her warm body against my chest, and I felt her tiny heartbeat fluttering against my skin like a new promise. For a moment, the world fell quiet. For a moment, I forgot the storm that had brought me here. For a moment, I felt whole. I whispered that I would protect her, that she would never feel unwanted, that I would never let the world make her believe she was a burden. Even in my exhaustion, even with fear clinging to my ribs, I felt something fierce forming inside me. I had lost almost everything, but I had gained her, and she was worth every loss. The next few days blurred together. The hospital discharged us quickly because my insurance covered very little. I left with a plastic bag full of sample diapers, a few tiny blankets, and instructions I could barely follow because my mind was too full of worry. I carried my daughter in a second-hand car seat the shelter had given me. The cold air outside stung my face as I stepped into the parking lot, feeling the weight of responsibility settling in my bones like a new kind of gravity. The shelter arranged a temporary room for me. It was small and dim, with thin walls and a mattress that sank too deeply in the middle. A single lamp flickered whenever the heater clicked on. The air smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet, but to me it was a sanctuary. I laid my daughter in the crib they provided and watched her sleep, her tiny fists curled near her face, her breath soft and steady. I sat beside the crib for hours that first night, afraid to close my eyes, afraid something would happen if I looked away. The exhaustion came quickly, the kind of exhaustion that settled deep in my bones and made my vision swim whenever I stood up too fast. My daughter woke every few hours, crying for milk or warmth or comfort. I fed her with shaking hands, singing softly even though my voice cracked from lack of sleep. There were nights when she cried for so long that my chest tightened with panic, and I had to set her gently in the crib, lean my forehead against the wall, and breathe until I could steady myself again. But even in the heaviness of those nights, in the ache of my body and the fog clouding my mind, I felt a strange kind of gratitude. I was exhausted, but I was grateful I still had her. She was the one part of my life that had not abandoned me. Her father, the boy I once believed I would build a future with, had left for a new city without a single message. His disappearance cut through me sharply at first, a quiet humiliation layered over the shame my dad had already carved into me. But holding my daughter in my arms made the hurt shift into something else. She felt like an angel resting against my chest, a reminder that even though I was alone, I had not been left with nothing. She was my proof that the world still held pieces of beauty, even in the middle of everything I had lost. Money disappeared faster than I could earn it. I took every job the shelter coordinator listed. I scrubbed floors in office buildings, folded laundry at a dry cleaner, and stocked shelves in a small grocery store. Each paycheck barely covered formula, diapers, and rent for the small room I moved into after leaving the shelter. There were days when I skipped meals so I could buy her enough formula to last until the next week. My stomach ached, but I told myself it was temporary. Hunger would not break me. I would not let it. My fear grew quietly, creeping into my thoughts late at night when the world felt too heavy. I feared my daughter would grow up remembering the dimness of that room. I feared she would see the tired lines on my face and think they were her fault. I feared she would learn to associate love with struggle. And beneath all of it, I feared that one day I might become the kind of parent who gave up, the kind who let shame dictate her choices. More than once I thought about going back to my dad. The idea would slip into my mind during the worst moments, like a cold draft through a cracked window. Maybe he had meant something different. Maybe time had softened him. Maybe he would see my daughter and change. But each time the thought appeared, I remembered the way his voice sounded when he told me I was dead to him. I remembered the cold porch, the heavy bags, the snow swallowing my footsteps. I remembered the look in his eyes, sharp and final. So I refused to return. Every time the urge rose, I let it burn through me until it became strength. I promised myself that my child would never be raised by a man who could erase his own daughter. I would rather raise her in that small room with flickering lights than under a roof where love was conditional. There were nights I almost broke anyway. Nights when my daughter would not stop crying no matter what I did. Nights when the exhaustion blurred the edges of the room and I felt myself drifting into a place where logic no longer lived. I remember one night in particular when the heater had stopped working and the air grew so cold that I wrapped my daughter in every blanket I owned. I sank onto the floor beside her and pressed my hands to my eyes until tears forced their way through. I whispered to myself that I could not do this, that I was failing, that she deserved more than a mother who had nothing to give. But then she stirred in her sleep, her small body curling toward the warmth, her breath softening, and the sight of her steadied me. I picked myself up piece by piece each night, reminding myself that she was worth every struggle I faced. Eventually, I found a slightly better room in an old building near the edge of town. The rent was low because the windows rattled in the wind and the pipes groaned at night, but it was mine. There was a small kitchenette where I could warm bottles. There was enough floor space for a secondhand playmat I found at a thrift store. I hung a string of cheap fairy lights along the wall to make the room feel less bleak. My daughter seemed to like watching the tiny lights flicker, and I liked pretending it made our world a little brighter. But even with the new room, money was still tight. I worked long hours and slept in small fragments, too aware of every noise, every bottle to prepare, every diaper to change. My body ached constantly. Some mornings my back felt stiff as stone, and my hands trembled from fatigue. I was young, but struggle had aged me faster than time. During this period, I often walked past a small diner on my way to whichever job I had picked up for the week. It sat on the corner of an older neighborhood, its windows warm with yellow light even before sunrise. The sign outside was chipped, and the paint peeled on the door, but there was something inviting about it. Through the windows I could see steam rising from the kitchen, servers moving between tables with practiced grace, and customers sipping hot coffee like it was the best thing they would taste all day. Every time I passed the diner, I felt a strange pull. It was not hunger. It was not a curiosity. It was something deeper, a longing for a place where people sat and talked and warmed their hands on mugs of coffee. A longing for a sense of belonging I had not felt since before my life had collapsed. Something about the diner felt steady in a way that nothing else in my world was. One morning, as I passed by on my way to the laundromat, I noticed a small sign taped to the window. It was handwritten, slightly crooked. It said they were looking for help. The words were simple, but they made my heart jolt. I stopped walking and stared at the sign for a long moment. I imagined myself inside, wiping tables, pouring coffee, smiling at strangers. I imagined a job that was more than just survival, a job that could offer the possibility of community. But fear held me still. I had failed too many times. I had been told I was not enough for too long. The thought of walking in and asking for work made my stomach twist. My daughter deserved stability, and I did not know if I could provide it in a place that seemed so alive, so demanding, so connected. I worried I would fall short. I worried I would be turned away. I worried I would not be able to carry both my exhaustion and my responsibilities into a space that looked so full of energy. I stood there with my daughter sleeping against my chest, her small breath warming the fabric of my coat. I looked at the sign again,
feeling something inside me tremble. A part of me whispered that this could be the beginning of something new. Another part of me whispered that I was not ready. I turned away and continued walking, telling myself I would think about it. But I felt the sign watching me as I left, like a door waiting for me to return when I finally found the courage to step through it. The next morning, I arrived at the diner before the sky had fully brightened. The air outside held a sharp chill, but the moment I stepped through the front door, the warmth inside pressed gently against my skin like a familiar hand. The scent of coffee, butter, and frying potatoes drifted through the room, wrapping around me in a way that always made me breathe a little easier. If there was one place in my life that felt like it had never betrayed me, it was this diner. Evelyn was already there, standing behind the counter, wiping the same spot she always wiped when she was thinking too much. Her hair was pulled into the same loose bun she had worn every day since the first time I met her. She glanced up as I entered and nodded once in that soft way of hers. She never asked unnecessary questions. She never pried. She simply created an atmosphere where people could breathe. When I first came to this diner years ago, I was barely standing. I had been living in a rented room I could barely afford, working too many shifts at a laundromat for too little money, and trying to keep myself from collapsing under the weight of feeding myself and a newborn at the same time. I remembered walking in that first morning with my clothes still smelling faintly of detergent and fear. One of the cooks had been out sick, and they needed someone to help wash dishes. Evelyn asked if I could start immediately. I nodded because I could not imagine saying no to anything that offered even a small doorway out of the life I was trapped in. I had been trembling that first day, not from cold, but because I had forgotten what it felt like to be somewhere that did not expect the worst from me. I made mistakes. I moved too slowly. I nearly broke a plate. But Evelyn did not raise her voice. She simply touched my elbow lightly and told me to breathe more evenly. She said it in the kind of tone you use with people who have been bruised too deeply to trust themselves. As I moved through the diner now, carrying trays, refilling mugs, and wiping tables between customers, I thought about how far I had come since those early days. My steps were steady. My hands no longer shook. My voice no longer faltered when I greeted customers. I had grown roots here, slow but strong, and the diner had become a small, stubborn piece of proof that my life had value, even when my dad tried to convince me otherwise. During the lull between breakfast and lunch, I joined Evelyn at the counter to help restock napkins. She glanced at me with the same perceptive eyes she had always had and asked gently if I had slept well. It was not surveillance. It was simply care. I told her it had been a long night. She nodded, as if she had expected that answer. She never pushed for details, and that restraint made her the safest person I had known in years. While I worked, my thoughts drifted again to the motel room where my dad now rested. I tried to shake the image of him sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the worn carpet as if it held answers he did not want to face. I tried to ignore the heaviness in his shoulders and the hollow sound in his voice. I reminded myself that pity is not the same as reconciliation, and compassion does not remove boundaries. But the memory of the message I had seen on his phone kept brushing against my mind like a loose thread. The sender was the woman he had chosen after my mom, the one who filled my place in that house long before I was thrown out. Seeing her name lit across his phone felt like someone had pressed a cold hand against the back of my neck. I knew it was not my place to read the message, not my right to pry, but the hint of it suggested that whatever story my dad had told me was far from complete. As the morning rush faded, Evelyn motioned toward the back room. She told me with her quiet expression that she needed help restocking supplies. When we were alone in the storage area, she paused and looked at me with the kind of concern that never felt intrusive. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to tell her that my dad had returned after 10 years and that I had let him into my home. I wanted to tell her that his sudden weakness pulled at me in ways I did not want to acknowledge. But the words stayed inside me. Speaking to them felt too vulnerable, too raw, like pulling back a bandage that had finally started to adhere. So I told her only that my dad was back in town. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but she did not look surprised. She nodded slowly, giving me space to continue if I wanted. But I did not. She simply placed a hand on my shoulder again and squeezed gently. It was enough to steady me without unraveling me. When my shift ended,
I removed my apron and hung it on the hook in the back room. I sat for a moment at the small employee table, exhaling slowly as the fatigue settled into my bones. My thoughts felt scattered, but not confused. More like puzzle pieces, turning themselves slowly, trying to find where they belonged. On the drive to the motel, the winter sun glared through the windshield. I could feel the tension in my shoulders building as I neared the parking lot. When I arrived, I saw that the curtains in his room were drawn tightly shut. The sight made my chest tighten. I knocked softly and waited. He opened the door halfway. He looked unshaven, tired, and uncomfortable. The room behind him smelled of old carpet and reheated food. I asked how he was holding up. He said in a flat voice that he needed more time, and that things had been worse than he could explain. He spoke vaguely about financial trouble, about betrayal, about health issues that had crept up faster than he had expected. His words came slowly, as if he were choosing each one carefully, constructing a version of events that painted him in softer colors. As he talked, I watched the way his eyes darted away from mine whenever the story got too close to honesty. He was telling me something, but he was not telling me everything. And beneath the words was a plea he did not want to voice. He needed help. He wanted shelter. He wanted me to catch him in the same hands he had let go of when I was 18. I handed him a small bag of groceries I had brought. He took it, and his fingers brushed mine lightly. It was a strange feeling, touching the man who had once stepped aside and let me fall. A part of me wanted to pull back, but another part held steady. I reminded myself that offering necessities did not mean offering absolution. He stepped back into the room without inviting me inside. I did not mind. I was not here to rewrite the past. I was here to manage the present. I told him I would check in again tomorrow. His expression tightened for a moment, as if he expected more from me, but he said nothing. He simply closed the door slowly. Walking back to my car, the cold wind lifted my hair and carried it across my face. I felt a familiar mix of heaviness and clarity settling deep in my chest. I sat inside the car for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, letting the quiet fill me. It was not sorrow, it was not anger. It was something steadier, something like resolve. On my way back home, I passed the diner again. Through the windows, I could see Evelyn wiping down a table, her movements slow and patient. I felt a small warmth in my chest at the sight of her. I had met her at one of the lowest points in my life, when the nights were long and the days were a blur of exhaustion. She had given me work when I had nothing. She had believed in me before I believed in myself. She had become the kind of figure my life had been missing. A steady presence who expected nothing in return. As I parked in front of my building, I thought about the diner and how it had saved me. It had not saved me with grand gestures or dramatic rescues. It saved me through repetition, day after day, shift after shift. It taught me that small routines could stitch a life back together. It gave me a place to stand, a place where I learned I was more than the hurt I had carried. Inside my condo, I took my coat off and hung it near the door. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles into your bones when you have lived through years of noise. I sat at the kitchen table and wrapped my hands around a warm mug of tea. I let the steam rise against my face and breathed slowly. As I sat there, the message I had seen on my dad's phone returned to my mind. The sender was the woman he married after my mom. The preview had been brief, but something about it had struck me as urgent, maybe even threatening. It was as if the message had not been meant for my eyes at all, and that knowledge created a small but undeniable tremor in my chest. I did not know what the full message said. I did not know what story my dad was hiding, but I knew that something inside me had shifted the moment I saw her name. A quiet alarm had gone off, a signal that the situation was not what it appeared to be. The night grew darker outside. The lights from the street lamps cast long, soft shadows across the living room floor. I sat there for a long time, letting the silence settle around me, feeling the steady pulse of questions forming beneath my skin. Something was off. Something in my dad's story did not line up. Something in that message felt like the first crack in a door I had not yet opened. But I would open it. Not out of revenge. Not out of anger, but because I had learned to survive the dark once before, and I was not afraid to look into it again. I returned to the motel the next afternoon, after my dad said he would like to talk. To me. The sky hung low with soft winter clouds, and the air tasted of cold metal. I parked in the same spot and sat for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel,
letting the hum of the engine fade into silence. I tried to steady myself, reminding my body that this was only a visit, not an unraveling. But there was something about the way my dad had looked at me the day before that, stuck like frost on a window pane. Something about the message that had flashed on his phone. Something that felt off in the space between his words. When I knocked on the door, he opened it after a short delay. He looked different than he had the day before, not physically, but in the way he held himself. His shoulders were drawn inward, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting someone to appear behind me. The room smelled faintly of reheated food and the stale scent of the motel carpet. He motioned toward the small table near the window, and I sat down, studying him carefully. He began talking almost immediately, as if he had been practicing his story in the hours since I left. He said things had gone wrong in ways he never expected. He told me that the woman he married after my mom had grown distant. He said she depended on him heavily at first, leaning on his income, his presence, his willingness to pick up every broken piece in her life. He said he thought he was doing the right thing by supporting her and her son, believing they would form a new family that would heal the parts of him that had hardened over the years. He paused then, looking out the window at nothing in particular. His voice softened when he mentioned he had grown to care for the boy, the son she had brought into the marriage. He had tried to help him get through school, tried to guide him into steady work, tried to give him the kind of structure he had once believed was the foundation of a strong family. But according to him, nothing had worked. The boy struggled with money, with decisions, with people. My dad said he had stepped in too often, trying to fix things that were never his to fix. As he spoke, I listened quietly. I forced myself not to react, not to fall into the old habit of shrinking beneath his words. Instead, I watched him. Not as a daughter seeking acceptance, but as a woman who had learned to survive disappointment. His voice carried the weight of someone telling the truth, but there was something in the details that did not settle right in my mind. He said the boy had gotten into trouble with credit cards. He said he had begged for help. He said he had dragged my dad into debt that spiraled faster than he could manage. He said he had signed papers he barely understood, believing they would help, only for them to turn into loans he could not pay back. He said the boy had promised again and again to change, to make things right, to work harder. But the promises never lasted. I nodded slowly, but my mind caught on something. My dad had always been cautious with money, almost to the point of obsession. He had once lectured me for weeks because I had used a coupon incorrectly. He had taught me to track every dollar, to save for emergencies, to avoid borrowing at all costs. It did not make sense that he would suddenly surrender control over his finances to someone else. Not without protest. Not without anger. Not without the kind of explosive reaction he had given me when I told him I was pregnant. My dad continued speaking, painting himself as a man betrayed. He said his wife had turned cold when the money ran out. He said she had stopped speaking to him with affection, that she barely looked at him anymore. He said she and her son had started making decisions without him, whispering behind closed doors, disappearing for hours without explanation. He said he felt like a stranger in his own home. He said one day he came home and found them packing. His wife told him they needed space, that he had become a burden, that they could no longer carry him through his health issues. My dad explained that he had developed problems with his blood sugar and his blood pressure. He said he felt tired all the time, dizzy when he stood up too quickly, drained in a way he had never known before. He said he needed rest. She said she needed freedom. They pushed him out. That was his version, but something inside me stirred with discomfort. It was not sympathy, although I did feel a flicker of that too. It was suspicious. Not because he was lying outright, but because parts of the story felt rehearsed, too smooth, too practiced, like stones polished by years of being turned over in the same hand. People tell the truth in jagged fragments. They stumble. They circle back. They fill empty spaces with raw emotion. But he spoke in a straight line, following a path he had paved himself. And beneath the surface was something I recognized from childhood, a refusal to take responsibility, a need to place blame somewhere that was not himself. He reached for a bottle of water and took a slow sip. His hand trembled, but I could not tell if it was weakness or nerves. He continued by saying he had nowhere to go, that the few friends he once relied on had drifted away. He said he had spent long nights staring at the ceiling, wondering how everything had fallen apart. He said he came to me because he did not know what else to do. I listened. I kept my face calm, I kept my voice steady. I offered no comfort. I offered no criticism. I simply let his words fill the room while my mind sifted through them, picking apart the details like threads unraveling from a worn sweater. I remembered the message on his phone, the name of his wife glowing on the screen for a brief moment, the shape of the preview, a suggestion that he had not been abandoned the way he claimed, a hint that there was more to the story. Something hidden beneath the surface. I studied him while he talked. I watched the way he leaned forward as if trying to pull sympathy from my body. I watched the way he paused at predictable moments, giving me a chance to react. I watched the way he looked around the room, avoiding my eyes when the story grew thin at the edges. I began to understand something important. He was not seeking connection. He was seeking rescue. He finished by saying he could not go back to that house, not after everything that had happened. He said he hoped I might give him a chance to rebuild, that I might forgive him for the past and see the man he was now. My chest tightened at that. Forgiveness. The word slid into the space between us like a blade wrapped in silk. He had thrown me into a storm without looking back. He had cut me out of his life with a softness that had left deeper scars than any shout. And now he wanted me to open my door. My heart, my life. But something inside me had changed. Something rooted itself firmly in the ground of who I had become. I had spent years growing my strength quietly, watering it with exhaustion and grief and small victories. I had learned to trust actions, not words. So I told him gently, in the kind of slow, measured tone I had learned from nurses and social workers, that I heard what he was saying. But I told myself something different. I told myself that I would not be moved by stories alone. I needed to see who he really was, not who he claimed to be, not who he wanted me to believe he was. He nodded slowly, perhaps thinking I agreed with more than I had said. He leaned back in the chair, letting out a breath as if relieved. I watched him gather himself, watched the weight of his story settle into the folds of his jacket. I wondered how much of it was real, and how much of it was crafted to soften me. Before I left, I asked him what his plans were for the next few days. He gave vague answers. He said he needed time to think, time to recover. He said he would figure things out once he regained his strength. The way he said it tightened something inside me. Plans were not things he had come prepared to make. He had come prepared to lean on me. When I stepped outside the motel door, the cold air cleared my mind. I walked slowly to my car, feeling the cracked pavement beneath my boots. The sky above was pale and shifting, clouds stretching and thinning like pulled cotton. I placed my hand on the roof of my car and took a long breath. His story did not make sense. Not completely. Not in the places that mattered. Even the timeline felt fractured. Events blurred together in ways that benefited him. He painted himself as a man who had been used, abandoned, cast aside. But something in me whispered that he had chosen pieces of the story carefully, leaving out the parts that might cast him in the light he feared most. I knew then that I would not take his words at face value. I had done that once before, when I believed the world would forgive me for being young and hopeful and human. I had listened to the wrong voice then, and it had cost me everything. So I drove away from the motel with a new clarity settling into my bones. I would help him survive. That was compassion, but I would not help him rewrite the truth. That was protection. For me, for my daughter, for the life I had built without him. By the time I reached my building, the decision was already made deep in the quiet part of my mind. I would trust what he did, not what he said. And I would begin watching closely. I arrived at the motel just after mid-morning, when the winter sun sat low and pale above the rooftops. The air outside tasted sharp, like the cold could scrape the back of my throat if I breathed too deeply. I knocked once on the door and waited. My dad opened it slowly, his shoulders hunched and his expression drawn tight across his face. He stepped aside to let me in, and I walked into the dim room with cautious steps, taking in the stale air and the faint hum of the heater that rattled each time him clicked on. He sat heavily on the edge of the bed and began talking again. He always began talking quickly, as if silence were something he could not risk. He told more pieces of his story, bits of struggle, fragments of disappointment, complaints about illness, and suggestions that he had been mistreated in ways he did not deserve. I stood by the window and listened, watching the thin strip of daylight stretch across the worn carpet. His voice filled the room like a fog, thick but without shape. I nodded occasionally. I murmured acknowledgement, but I did not absorb every detail. Instead, I watched his behavior, the way he paused at convenient moments, the way he emphasized his innocence, the way he circled around the same points without ever landing on anything concrete. His story had too many smooth edges for a man who had lived through chaos. It felt curated, practiced, designed. I told myself to stay calm, to stay steady, to let him talk. The truth would reveal itself if I allowed enough silence to fall in the right places. After a while, he stood and pressed his hand to his side, saying he needed a moment in the bathroom. His steps were slow, almost heavy, as he shuffled across the room and pushed the bathroom door mostly closed behind him. Water ran in a thin stream from the faucet, echoing off the tile in rhythmic splashes. I turned toward the small table near the window where he had set his phone earlier. I did not intend to look. I did not want to invite trouble, but my eyes drifted there anyway, the way a person stares at a flame, even while knowing it might burn them. The phone lit up. Just a soft glow, a quiet vibration, and then I saw the message preview. It was from the woman he married after my mom, the woman who had spent years at his side in the house I once lived in, the woman who now, according to him, wanted nothing to do with him. I could not see the full message, only the first few words, but it was enough. The tone of it was sharp, urgent, expectant. Not the tone of a woman who had cast my dad aside. Not the tone of someone who had abandoned him completely. Not even the tone of someone grieving a broken marriage. It was the tone of someone waiting for a plan to unfold. A strange chill ran along my arms. I stepped back, willing myself to breathe normally. I did not want to read too much into a single preview. A message can hold many meanings. But my instincts, sharpened by years of learning to read danger in small movements, told me this was not a message of concern. This was not an accident. This was not harmless. This was a sign that I had been drawn into something I did not yet understand. I looked toward the bathroom. The water was still running. My dad hummed softly under his breath, unaware that his phone had betrayed him. My pulse quickened. I wrapped my arms around myself and stood still until my breathing evened out. He stepped out of the bathroom a few moments later, wiping his face with a hand towel. He looked more refreshed, more composed, as if the warm water had washed away the exhaustion he had been performing earlier. He glanced at me briefly, then picked up his phone without noticing the way my eyes followed the movement. He began talking again, returning to his story. He described his illness. He described how he had been left with nothing. He described how his wife had turned on him. He described how I was his only hope. But now the words passed over me like water over stone. I no longer clung to them. I no longer let them settle in my mind. I watched him instead. I watched the small shifts in his expression. I watched the calculated heaviness in his voice. I watched the way he held his phone tightly now, as if guarding it. A truth formed inside me slowly. He had not come to me for healing. He had not come to me because of love or reconciliation. He had come because he needed something. Something specific. Something planned. And the woman who had taken my place in his life had a hand in it. I left the motel soon after, offering only a soft promise to check in again. He nodded, but there was a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. Not disappointed in me. Disappointment that the conversation had not achieved whatever goal he had set. The cold air outside hit me like a wave. I drew my coat tighter around my body and walked to my car with slow steps. My mind buzzed quietly, not with panic, but with focus. I had lived through enough hardship to know when a story was wrong, and this one was wrong at its core. On the drive home, I found myself thinking not of my dad, but of Evelyn. The diner had become a second home to me over the years. Evelyn had given me work when I had nothing. She had given me encouragement when I had forgotten how to believe in myself. She had taught me to move with confidence, to speak with steadiness, to navigate the world with dignity. She knew pieces of my story, the important pieces, the painful ones, the ones that shaped the way I carried myself. If there was anyone I trusted to hear what I had just seen, it was her. When I arrived at the diner that afternoon, the lunch rush had just ended. The bell above the door chimed softly as I stepped inside. The warmth, the clatter of dishes, and the low hum of conversations washed over me like a balm. Evelyn stood behind the counter, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She looked up as I approached. Her eyes softened with recognition, but she said nothing at first. She did not need to. I walked to the far end of the counter where the traffic slowed and the air felt a little quieter.
She followed me with calm, steady steps. She asked softly if things with my dad had gotten more complicated. I nodded. The words sat heavy in my throat, but I let them spill out piece by piece. I told her I had seen a message on his phone. I told her it was from his wife. I told her the tone did not match the story he had been telling me. I told her the message felt like instructions. I told her I felt as if something was unfolding beneath the surface, and that I did not know how deep it ran. Evelyn listened without interrupting. She rested her hands lightly on the counter and studied my face. When I finished, she breathed slowly, as if weighing her response. She said that when people lie, they leave trails behind them. She said that words can be shaped into any form, but behavior tells the truth in quiet ways. She said that if my instincts were stirring, there was a reason. And then she said there was someone I should talk to. An old friend of hers, a retired detective. A man who had once handled domestic cases and financial crimes, and who now took on small investigations for people who needed help but did not know where to start. She said he was discreet. She said he was patient. She said he was someone who could see patterns in chaos. For a moment, I felt the weight of her offer press deeply against my ribs. Hiring a private investigator felt drastic. It felt like crossing into a new territory where suspicion became action. It felt like acknowledging that my dad might be capable of more manipulation than I wanted to believe. But I also knew this. I had a daughter to protect. I had a life I had built with my own hands. I had a strength my dad did not expect. If he had brought danger to my doorstep, I would not allow it to seep into the corners of my world unchecked. I met Evelyn's eyes. I thanked her quietly, unable to express how much it meant to have someone on my side in a way my own family never had. She squeezed my hand gently. Her touch was warm and reassuring. That evening, I walked home with a clearer sense of purpose. The sky above me deepened to shades of blue and violet. The air carried the crisp promise of another cold night. I felt tired, but beneath the exhaustion was something steadier, something like resolve. My dad had come to me with a story made of half truth and half performance. His wife had sent him messages that revealed a hidden plan, and I had seen enough struggle in my life to know that trusting the wrong person could undo everything I had fought for. So the decision rose naturally within me. I would not confront him yet. I would not reveal what I had seen. I would not risk tipping him off. I would find the truth quietly, through someone who knew how to uncover the parts of a story that people try to bury. I would hire the detective, and whatever secrets my dad and his wife were hiding would come into the light soon enough. I met the retired detective 2 days after speaking with Evelyn. His name was Bennett, a quiet man, with steady eyes and a calm way of listening that made people feel seen without feeling judged. He had worked in the city for decades before stepping away from official work, but he still held the posture of someone who understood how to move through the world without being noticed. I met him in a corner booth at the diner after my shift ended. Evelyn introduced us with the kind of gentle respect she reserved for people she had trusted deeply. I told him that I did not know exactly what I was asking for. I told him I only knew that something felt wrong. I told him I had seen a message on my dad's phone and that it did not match anything he had told me. Bennett nodded slowly, absorbing every detail without distraction. He asked calm questions, not to interrogate me, but to understand the shape of the situation. He never reacted with shock or disbelief. He simply took notes with a small notebook he carried and repeated back what he had understood, making sure he had the facts straight. I explained where my dad was staying. I told him how long he had been there. I told him that I had paid for the room myself because I did not want the motel to think they were responsible for any trouble. Bennett nodded again and said he would take a look. He said there was usually a pattern when people concealed parts of their stories. He said he did not need to know the emotional details, only the factual ones. I felt a strange sense of relief when he said that. Feelings had been pulling me in too many directions. Facts were something I could trust. He told me to go about my routines as usual. He said he would observe quietly for a few days and then tell me what he found. I thanked him, and he simply nodded, as if gratitude was unnecessary. When he stood to leave, the movement was so unhurried and quiet that I barely noticed the moment he reached the door. I wondered if that was how someone like him managed to gather the truth, by blending into the background until people forgot they were being watched. The following days felt long. I worked my shifts at the diner, took care of my daughter, and visited my dad briefly to make sure he had enough food and that he was taking his medication. Each visit felt heavier. He grew more comfortable, speaking as if he assumed I would one day let him into my home. He worried aloud about the cost of long-term housing. He mentioned that a family should help each other. He never once asked how I was managing the expense. He never once asked about my daughter. I told myself to stay calm. I told myself not to confront him. I told myself to wait for the facts. On the morning of the third day, Bennett called the diner and asked if I could step outside for a moment. I handed my table to another server and walked around the building to the alley, where the afternoon light fell softly across the pavement. Bennett stood leaning against his car, arms crossed loosely, watching me with that same calm expression. He said he had something to show me. I climbed into the passenger seat and sat quietly, bracing myself without knowing it. He opened a folder on his lap and laid out a few photographs. They were small, printed on cheap paper, but the images were clear. The first photo showed the motel parking lot. The second showed a familiar car pulling into a space near my dad's room. The third showed a woman stepping out. Even from the grainy quality of the image, I could see who she was. It was his wife. The same woman he had insisted wanted nothing to do with him. My breath tightened. My chest grew still. Bennett placed another photo on top. The woman stood near the motel door knocking. After a few seconds, my dad opened it. He stepped aside. She walked in. The door closed behind her. I stared at the photos until the edges of my vision blurred. Bennett waited before speaking again. He said she had come to the motel twice in the past 2 days. Once in the morning, once at dusk. He said she stayed inside for several minutes each time. He said she did not look distressed or angry. She looked focused. He placed another photograph in front of me. This time it was a young man standing at the door of my dad's room. The son. The same son my dad had described as irresponsible and destructive. The same son he claimed had drained him emotionally and financially. The photo showed him holding a folder under his arm. He looked around once, then stepped inside the room. My stomach dropped. The pattern was unmistakable. Bennett told me quietly that this was not a situation of abandonment. This was a situation of coordination. He said the behavior of my dad's wife and her son indicated ongoing involvement, not separation. He said they entered the room with familiarity, not caution. He said they spoke to my dad in low tones, their faces tense, but not hostile. He said it looked like discussions, not confrontations. He placed another photo on the stack. The woman was leaving the motel. The son stood beside her. They spoke briefly in the parking lot. Their expressions, even blurred by distance, were not the expressions of people who had cut ties with my dad. They were the expressions of people working through a plan. In the final photograph, the son held up a hand as if gesturing. The woman nodded before getting into her car. It was an easy movement, a comfortable one, not a gesture between estranged family members. My dad stepped out of the doorway briefly, watching them leave. I felt something hollow open inside my chest. Not sadness, not shock, but a quiet confirmation of something I had sensed long before the evidence appeared. My dad had lied. Not just in small ways, not just to soften his story. He had hidden entire truths beneath false helplessness. He had come to me claiming he had no one. But he had people. He had a wife who still communicated with him. He had a stepson who visited him regularly. He had resources and connections he had chosen not to reveal. So what was his purpose in coming to me? My hands trembled slightly as I rested them on my knees. I felt the weight of the truth pressing into my skin like cold metal. The facts did not lie. The photographs did not lie. The behavior did not lie. Bennett told me he had not gone inside the motel or listened through the door. He said he never used invasive methods. He said he relied on observation, and what he saw convinced him that my dad was involved in something complex, something that required my involvement, something that would benefit him and the people connected to him. He said there were signs of financial planning, people arriving with folders, people speaking with urgency, people entering and leaving in rotational patterns. He said none of it matched the story of a man abandoned and desperate. I closed my eyes for a moment. I saw myself at 18,
standing in the snow with my bags at my feet. I saw the soft click of the door closing behind me. I saw the way my dad refused to look at me. I remembered the cold that seeped into my bones, the cold that told me I had no place left to belong. Now he had returned, not because he had grown, not because he sought repair, but because he needed something from me. Again. Only this time, he came with company hidden behind the shadows. I opened my eyes and looked at the photographs again. The truth was right there. My dad had woven a story designed to control my emotional response. He had played the part of the abandoned man. He had leaned on illness. He had spoken of betrayal. He had made himself small so that I might rise to lift him. But the facts told a different story. He was not alone. He was not abandoned. He was not without resources. He had a plan. And I was part of it. I thanked Bennett quietly. He nodded and said he would continue observing if I wanted. He said he could dig deeper, but only if I asked him to. I told him I needed time to think. He did not push. He closed the folder gently and placed it on the dashboard. When I stepped out of the car, the cold air wrapped around me like a reminder. I walked slowly around the building, letting the truth settle into my bones. The sky above me looked pale and stretched thin, as if winter itself had been holding its breath. I returned to the diner and asked Evelyn if we could speak briefly in the back room. She followed me without hesitation. When I showed her the photographs, she sighed softly, not with shock, but with a kind of sad recognition. She placed her hand on my arm and told me that some people returned not out of love, but out of need. She told me that it was time to protect the life I had built. I left the diner with a new sense of clarity. Each step felt heavier, but also more grounded. The world had not become safer, but it had become clearer, and clarity was its own kind of strength. By the time I arrived home, I knew what I had to do. I would continue letting my dad believe I did not know the truth. I would continue to visit. I would continue to offer small acts of support, but I would not trust a single word he said. I would trust only the facts. And the facts had already been spoken. My dad did not come to me because he needed family. He came because he needed a foothold. And I would not let him find one in my home or in my life. I waited 2 more days before confronting my dad, not out of fear, and not because I needed time to rehearse what I would say, but because I wanted the truth to settle into me fully before I spoke it aloud. I knew that once I brought the evidence forward, there would be no way to return to the uneasy peace we had been walking through. I had to be certain that I was ready for the consequences, whatever they were. The truth was not meant to soothe. The truth was meant to clarify. And clarity had a way of changing everything it touched. During those 2 days, I went through my routines as if nothing had shifted. I worked my shifts at the diner. I cooked dinner for my daughter. I folded laundry. I walked her to school and listened to her stories about classmates who traded stickers and argued over who got the last swing. I smiled when she smiled. I steadied her backpack when it slid off her shoulder. I brushed her hair back from her face before bed and watched her drift into sleep. These moments were the real center of my life, the core of everything I had fought to build. They reminded me of what was at stake. But beneath the surface of each ordinary moment, the photographs from Bennett drifted like shadows. The image of my dad's wife knocking on his motel door. The image of the son arriving with a folder. The way their bodies angled toward him. Familiar, comfortable, coordinated. The way he had stood outside afterward, watching them leave with a look that was not grief, but calculation. He had told me he was alone. But he was not alone. He had told me he was betrayed. But he was still aligned with them. He had told me he needed me, but he needed something from me, something he had not yet revealed. By the 3rd morning, the decision rose inside me with quiet certainty. The truth had simmered long enough. It was time to face him. The air outside the motel was crisp and dry. A thin layer of frost clung to the railings and the tops of the cars in the parking lot. The sky was a pale winter blue, stretched thin across the horizon. I breathed deeply before knocking. The cold bit into my skin, sharpening my focus. When the door opened, my dad looked surprised to see me so early. He stepped aside with a weary motion, expecting me to walk in as I always had. I did. The room was dim, lit only by the thin strip of daylight sneaking between the curtains. He sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm them. I stayed standing. I told him that I had been thinking about his story. I told him there were parts of it I did not understand. I told him that I had started to wonder how everything had unfolded the way he described. He raised his eyebrows, as if offended that I questioned him. He said he had explained everything clearly. He said he did not know what else I needed to hear. I reached into my bag and whisked through the photographs Bennett had given me. My hands were steady. My breath was smooth. I laid the photos on the table between us one by one, giving him enough time to see each image before placing the next. My dad stared at them without blinking. At first he looked confused. Then his eyes narrowed. Then he looked at me. The first photo showed his wife arriving at the motel. The second showed the son stepping inside with a folder. The third showed them together outside. The fourth showed my dad watching them leave. I waited. The silence pulsed between us. He leaned back slightly, his jaw tightening. He said softly that things were complicated. He said I did not understand the full story. He said I was making assumptions based on fragments. He said he had reasons for not telling me everything. He said he had been afraid of how I might judge him. I listened without interrupting. I did not soften. I did not offer sympathy. I simply watched him, knowing that the truth now sat between us with undeniable weight. He continued with explanations that grew thinner and more tangled. He said his wife had visited only to collect belongings she had left with him. He said the son had come to bring documents related to debts they needed to finalize. He said the meetings were brief and unpleasant. He insisted they had nothing left to offer him. He insisted he truly had nowhere else to go. But the tone of his voice betrayed him. It was too smooth. Too practiced. I had spent my childhood listening to that voice. I knew its texture. I knew when it revealed the truth and when it concealed it. And this was concealment. I stepped closer to the table and rested my hand beside the photographs. I told him that I was done guessing. I told him that actions spoke louder than words. I told him that people who are abandoned are not visited twice in 2 days. I told him that people who are cut off do not exchange folders in parking lots. I told him that people who have no one do not receive messages filled with expectation. He swallowed hard and looked away. His hands clenched into fists on his lap. He tried to say that he was embarrassed, that he had not wanted to worry me, that he had been trying to protect me from a complicated situation. He said, but these were not explanations. They were excuses. And excuses are the quiet armor people wear when they do not want to face the truth of their own actions. I felt my shoulders grow lighter as I spoke the next words. I told him that I would continue to pay for the motel for a short period. I told him that I would not let him fall into the streets or into danger. That was the humanitarian line I would not cross. But I told him clearly that I would not open my home to him. I would not let him move into my life. I would not let him drag my daughter into a situation he refused to explain. I would not take on the chaos he had created. Not now, not ever. His face twisted, not with sorrow, not with remorse, but with a kind of sharp frustration. He told me I was ungrateful. He told me I was exaggerating. He told me I was choosing pride over family. And in that moment, I felt the coldest clarity settle into me. He did not come here to rebuild anything. He came here to control something, to use me, to shape my life the way he once shaped it, with shame and silence. I told him calmly that if he attempted to manipulate me or involve me in any financial situation without my knowledge, I would seek legal protection. I told him that if he tried to force his way into my home, I would call the authorities. I told him that I was not the 18-year-old he had cast out. I was a woman now, a mother, and I would protect my daughter with a fierceness he could not break. He stared at me, breathing hard. His anger tightened his features. For a moment, I saw the man from my childhood, the man whose disappointment had once swallowed the entire house, the man who had spoken words that had followed me into adulthood like shadows. But the difference was unmistakable. He no longer had power over me. He tried one last defense, saying that he had been trying to build a bridge between us, that he had hoped I would see him as changed, that he wanted another chance. But the photographs contradicted everything he said. His behavior contradicted everything he claimed. His story fell apart in his hands like dry leaves. I told him that if he truly wanted help, he needed to accept the boundaries I had placed. He needed to be honest. He needed to allow distance until trust could be rebuilt. He needed to respect the family I had created, the life I had built, the peace I had earned. He did not respond. The silence that followed was heavy, but not painful. It was the silence of recognition, the silence of understanding that the old ways would no longer work, the silence of a man realizing that the daughter he once dismissed had become a person he could not manipulate. I gathered the photographs and placed them back in my bag. He watched the movement with quiet tension, as if the evidence itself had betrayed him. I stepped toward the door, pausing only once. I told him that I would check in again next week. Not tomorrow, not the following day. Next week. Enough space to breathe. Enough time for him to understand I meant every boundary I placed. He nodded stiffly, unwilling to speak. The room around him felt smaller, as if his own choices had begun closing in on him. I stepped outside. The cold air hit my skin like a wake-up call. I walked toward my car with slow, steady steps, each one grounding me deeper in the person I had become. As I sat behind the wheel, I looked at the motel door one last time. It remained closed. No movement, no sound. Karma does not always arrive in dramatic forms. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Sometimes it arrives through the simple, unshakable reality that the person you once controlled no longer bends. The cold air filled my lungs. I turned the key and I drove away. The road stretched ahead of me in a long, quiet ribbon, and for the first time since my dad had shown up at my building with that moving truck, I felt the weight in my chest begin to shift. Not lighten, not disappear, just shift into something I could finally carry without breaking. I drove slowly, letting the cold air inside the car steady me, letting the silence settle where fear had lived for too long. Over the next week, I did exactly what I told him I would do. I paid for the motel room one more week. I dropped off bags of groceries, simple things he could heat in the small microwave. I left them with the front desk so I would not have to sit across from him and absorb the disappointment he believed I owed him. I did not avoid him. I simply refused to shrink under the weight of his expectations. My days returned to the rhythm I trusted. My daughter woke early, full of questions about school and friends, and whether she could bring her favorite book for reading time. I walked her to class, kissed the top of her head, and promised that dinner would be something warm and comforting. Then I drove to the diner, tied my apron, and stepped into the familiar hum of plates and coffee and morning regulars who greeted me with kindness. It felt good to move the way I used to. Not cautiously, not tensely, just freely, the way a person moves when she knows the ground beneath her will not collapse. Evelyn watched me closely at first, checking for any signs that I might be unraveling. When she saw I had found my footing again, she gave me a soft nod that said everything without saying a word. I was not the girl my dad had thrown into a storm. I was not the young mother who barely held herself together in a shelter room. I was a woman who had built a life, and I was protecting it. 3 days later, Bennett called me. His voice was steady as always. He said there had been movement. He said the stepfamily was not as distant as they wanted to appear. He said there were documents connected to my dad's name that had been filed recently, in a way that looked rushed and careless, as if someone were trying to pull something together before anyone noticed. I thanked him, and he told me to stay alert. I hung up slowly, letting the words settle. Part of me had known this was coming. People rarely manipulate only once. It becomes a pattern, a habit, a language they rely on. I sat for a moment at my kitchen table, watching the steam rise from my cup of tea. My daughter was drawing quietly in the living room, humming to herself, unaware of the shadows adults learn to navigate. The next morning, I received a call from my building manager. His tone was polite but concerned. He said someone claiming to be a family member had contacted the office asking if I could sign as a guarantor for temporary housing. He said they had mentioned my dad. He wanted to know if the request was legitimate. My stomach tightened. I told him firmly that I would not sign anything and that no one was authorized to use my name for housing, loans, or agreements of any kind. He said he understood and that he would flag my file. After I hung up, I sat there with my hands pressed flat against the table, letting the truth seep deeper. My dad had not learned. My dad had not changed. My dad had not come to rebuild anything. He had come to use me. Again. Only this time, his wife and her son were part of the push. I called Bennett. I told him what happened. He said calmly that this confirmed his findings. He said my dad had been part of conversations about financial arrangements that required a second signature. He said the stepfamily believed I might be vulnerable to guilt or confusion. He said this was their attempt to pull me into debt that would benefit them, not me. He said I had stopped that before it could begin. It felt unreal hearing it said aloud, not because I doubted the truth, but because a part of me still remembered the girl who once begged for my dad's approval. That girl would have signed anything to keep the peace. That girl would have believed every word he told her. That girl would have sacrificed her own survival to please a man who never asked about her dreams, her fears, or the child she carried alone. I was not that girl anymore. I thanked Bennett, and he told me that this was the moment to make things formal. He advised sending a letter to the motel and to my dad, stating in plain language that I would not co-sign anything, extend credit, or take on any financial obligation on his behalf. He said to keep a copy for myself. He said to deliver it without emotion. I felt something settle inside me at the thought of putting it in writing, something firm, something final. I went to the motel that afternoon. The cold had grown sharper, the kind that turned breath into small clouds. I walked to the front desk and asked them to deliver the letter to his room. I did not trust myself to hand it to him directly. Not because I feared him, because I did not want to offer any opening for guilt or theatrics. I left the motel with my coat pulled tight and my head held steady. That evening, my phone rang. I let it ring. My daughter sat on the floor building a tower of blocks, counting softly as she stacked each one. I watched her and felt the vibration of the phone against the table. I did not move to answer it. The call went to voicemail. It rang again. And again. By the fifth time, I turned the phone face down and focused on the small world in front of me, the world I had built with work, love, and sacrifice. On the sixth call, the ringing stopped. The next morning, I received a message from the motel. My dad had checked out. No forwarding information, no request for help, no confrontation. He simply left, taking whatever plans he had with him. Bennett later confirmed that his wife had picked him up. The son had been with her. They loaded some things into the back of the car. My dad did not look back at the motel entrance. He did not look relieved or angry. His face carried a kind of resignation, like a man who had expected a door to open for him and finally understood it would not. That was the quiet karma. Not revenge, not punishment. Just the slow realization that the person he believed he could control no longer existed. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel spite. I felt at peace. A peace so deep it filled every quiet moment, every morning drive to the diner, every bedtime story with my daughter, every soft breath I released into the cold air. Weeks passed, then months. I never heard from him again. Not a letter, not a voicemail. Not a message passed through someone else. He returned to whatever life he had built with the woman who stood beside him in those motel photographs. I did not ask for updates. I did not follow the trail. Some chapters close with noise. Others close with nothing at all. What mattered was that my life stayed steady. My daughter grew taller, braver, and more curious. The diner thrived, and Evelyn began teaching me parts of the business she planned to hand over one day. I woke each morning with a sense of gratitude that felt rooted, not fragile. My home stayed warm. My boundaries stayed firm. And my heart stayed whole. People often believe that forgiveness is the final step, but some wounds do not heal that way. Some wounds do not ask for forgiveness. They ask for distance. They ask for clarity. They ask for the strength to choose peace over obligation. I chose peace. I chose my daughter. I chose myself. If someone had told me when I was 18, standing in the snow with my bags on the ice, that one day I would find strength in saying no, I would not have believed them. But strength grows quietly. It grows in small decisions. It grows in the spaces where we refuse to repeat old patterns. It grows in the lives we build with our own hands. Tonight, as I sit by my window watching the streetlights glow in the cold air, I feel that strength as something solid inside me. The door I closed was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of survival. It was an act of love.
It was an act of truth. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this: silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.